Welcome to the 6th lecture for Between War and Peace. This week we're going to be focusing on positive incentives. Last week we looked at non-violent methods of trying to resist serious conflict and human rights violations. We focused particularly on civilian defense, civilian peacekeeping, and the debates around pacifism and non-violence. We saw that civilian defense and civilian peacekeeping can still coerce somewhat aggressors because they impose upon them the threat that they will lose legitimacy or lose international support. So there's still an element of coercion involved with these measures. This week, we turn to a fully non-coercive option, and this is the use of positive incentives. Incentives include economic incentives, such as aid and investment in the state, political incentives, such as recognition, and legal incentives, such as amnesties and the granting of exile for leaders, which we're going to look at in part 3 of today's lecture. The lecture is going to be split up into 3 parts. The first part will explore what economic incentives are and some of the arguments for them. The second part will explore some of the objections to incentives and political incentives. And the third part will focus particularly on amnesties and exile. The third part will be a bit shorter than the other 2 parts. Incentives have been widely used and somewhat successfully to limit nuclear proliferation in cases such as Argentina, Brazil, Kazakhstan, South Africa, South Korea, Sweden, Taiwan, and Ukraine. They've also been used to try to bring an end to conflicts within and between states, including in Bosnia, Burundi, Israel, Palestine, Northern Ireland, Papua New Guinea, South Africa, Sri Lanka, and Yemen. The use of such incentives raises the obvious worry that they reward those who commit wrongdoing, such as those engaged in mass atrocities. To give you an example, in the summer of 2015, the possibility of offering exile to Bashar al-Assad in Syria was frequently mooted in the public debate about the potential ways of resolving this terrible conflict. Would it be wrong to grant Assad exile, given that he's being implicated significantly in crimes against humanity? Would it be wrong to give him a reward to let him off the hook? Similarly, is it justifiable to offer political recognition to groups that have been involved in or linked to terrorist activities if this will help to end a conflict? For instance, in 1994, the United States granted a visa to the Sinn Féin leader Gerry Adams. At the time, he was seen as a spokesperson for the IRA. If he appeared on British television, his face would be covered by kind of a black box. It was very controversial at the time. Here's a video of his visit.
This is not the Trump card, but I think I would...
Come to him here in America, but what I'm here to highlight is the fact that he's actively involved in the continual beatings of young people in nationalist areas in Northern Ireland. That's why I'm here, you know.
Which are still denied citizens. The British still maintain jurisdiction over a section of our people and over a section of our country. And what we have to do amounts to a tremendously massive endeavour. We have to make peace with a government which is sought only to oppress us. And we have to make peace with a section of our own people whose leadership has sought for decades only to discriminate against us. But let me say this. The peace process in which we are engaged threatens no one. The Ireland we want would not be worth struggling for if it did not involve the Northern Unionists, the Northern Protestants, our brothers and sisters on that island.
Wife was murdered, and the other two paragraphs he justified the existence of the Provos, of Sinn Féin, of the IRA, claiming that they were fighting for a just and lasting peace. Well, I'm sorry, but I don't see how my wife's murder helped IRA, Sinn Féin achieve peace. It's hypocrisy. Gerry Adams is a hypocrite.
I think.
Despite the controversy around the visit, it was widely seen at the time as playing a key role in the development of the peace process in Northern Ireland. So here's that's an interesting case where it's potentially arguably effective, but does it reward those that are allegedly involved? To some degree, I should emphasize, allegedly, with terrorism. There are also notable worries about the use of incentives that stem from other fields, such as notably health and education, such as concern that those using incentives will undermine moral motivations and in fact encourage the very behaviour that they attempt to address. These are some of the issues that we're going to be looking at today. Consider in this context what's called the Mo Ibrahim Prize. This is worth $5 million for 10 years and $20,000 annually thereafter. And it's given to African leaders who step down peacefully and show good governance.
Early Monday morning, and speculation was rife that retired President Mwai Kibaki was set to bag the prestigious Mo Ibrahim Prize for Excellence in African Leadership. But at about midday, those hopes were dashed.
The assumption is that we considered President Kibaki, and he was reaching.
Kenya's third president was piped to the prize by outgoing Namibian President Hifikepunye Pohamba at a ceremony held in Nairobi, Kenya.
We have heroes in Africa. It's not only Mandela.
Having met the criteria for serving out his constitutionally mandated term and handing over the reins of power after a largely peaceful general election 2 years ago, the Development Foundation, led by former President Mwai Kibaki, had made him eligible for the Mo Ibrahim Prize.
Now, do such prizes corrupt leaders' motivation when they should be intrinsically motivated to step down? So giving someone $5 million, should they actually should that be offered as an incentive? Or is it problematic because it encourages leaders to think in financial terms when they should step down anyway for the good of their country? Given these sorts of worries, the use of positive incentives in general in domestic political philosophy is very widely criticised. It's seen as encouraging bad behaviour, as rewarding wrongdoing, and potentially not particularly effective. And these are the sorts of worries that we're going to be looking at today. Before we get to these, though, let's look at what incentives are. Positive incentives are offers given to improve the position of the receiver. This is compared to the counterfactual. What this means is it's compared to the receiver's situation if they had not have had the offer. They differ from threats that, by contrast, would worsen the receiver's situation compared to what would have reasonably predicted to happen without the offer. They differ from threats. Just to reiterate, that will be the situation that we can reasonably predict if they hadn't been threatened. Now, you'll find that in the literature, various synonyms are used for incentives. These include inducements, engagement, offers, carrots, positive sanctions, rewards, checkbook diplomacy, and linkage. Sometimes an incentive may simply be the offering of ending of coercion. And perhaps the most notable example of this links us back to lecture 3 when we looked at economic sanctions. The lifting of economic sanctions can be seen as a positive incentive. To explain this, consider the following 2 cases. In case 1, South Africa proposes to the leaders of Burkina Faso that it will lift hypothetical ongoing sanctions on Burkina Faso if it halts the hypothetical killing of its mass civilians. This would still be a positive incentive. This is because it improves the situation of those in Burkina Faso. What's important here is that the sanctions were already present before the offer was made. Case number 2. Now suppose that South Africa informs the leaders of Burkina Faso that it will launch a new sanctions regime unless it halts mass killings. If Burkina Faso does halt the violations, then it would not be subject to the sanctions regime. This isn't a positive incentive, but instead is a threat because the sanctions are not ongoing. The sanctions would worsen the situation of the leaders compared to the lack of any further interference. David Baldwin, in his famous account of incentives, clarifies the meaning of the relationship between sanctions and incentives. He notes that situations in which the threat of punishment is withdrawn can be described as ones in which the sender uses negative sanctions, the punishment to lay the groundwork for the subsequent use of positive sanctions, the promise to withdraw the punishment if the receiver complies. What the sender is doing in such situations is using the stick to shift the receiver's baseline so as to make the subsequent promise of a carrot more attractive. A's offer to stop tipping the boat if B will row is unlikely to proceed by B as a carrot unless A is already tipping the boat at the time that the offer is made. This quote is from one of the required readings for this week. So we've seen then that incentives differ from threats, but incentives can involve the lifting of ongoing coercive measures. Despite all of that, it's also worth adding that sometimes offers do contain threats. These are what are technically called throffers. Another way of thinking this is that you can have a carrot and a stick at the same time. Suppose, for instance, that in the case we've looked at, in the case I've given, South Africa informs the leaders of Burkina Faso that it will lift its ongoing sanctions regime if Burkina Faso halts its mass killing. But on the other hand, if it doesn't do that, it will extend the sanctions regime. The leaders of Burkina Faso would be better off if they took the offer, but worse off if they didn't. This case then involves both a carrot and a stick, an incentive and a threat. What form do incentives take? Well, firstly, economic incentives. These include offers of humanitarian aid, the prospective purchase of goods or assets, prospective debt relief, potential investment, and offers of preferential trade deals, such as tariff reductions, most favored nation status, and subsidies for exports or imports. Economic incentives could be seen as bribes depending on the definition of bribery. So you might think, economic incentives are problematic because you're bribing people to do something that's morally potentially good, but you're offering them a bribe, which seems problematic because we think bribery is problematic. Now, what's important here is there are several different definitions of bribery, several different accounts in the literature and philosophy. Suppose that we define bribery broadly as offering financial rewards to persuade agents to do what you want them to do. This would include then incentives. And this, of course, has notable negative connotations. As I've suggested already, bribery is often seen as inducing someone to act immorally. But on this account, it also seems that bribery might be okay when certain conditions are met. In fact, the bribe might be used to induce agents to act morally. So I've got another case for you to explain what I'm trying to put forward here. Suppose that a lazy police officer won't investigate a murder. So the family pays the police officer to investigate the murder properly, the family of the victim. They do so. Police officer finds the culprit, who's then convicted. Has the family acted wrongly? It's pretty clear that the police officer has. The police officer should have investigated the crime without the offer of the incentive. But has the family? It's not clear that this is the case. So when bribery is defined broadly as offering financial rewards to persuade agents, individuals, states, other actors to do what you want them to do, it might not be morally wrong. On other accounts of bribery, you need to offer financial rewards to persuade people to act wrongly. So these accounts of bribery put wrongly, acting wrongly is in a definition of what it is to offer a bribe. It's persuading people to do something that's wrong. The first definition, you're just persuading them to do something that you want them to do. The second definition adds this clause of wrong. But then it's not clear that the positive incentives would fall under this. And in particular, the sorts of positive incentives that we're going to be looking at in today's lecture, positive incentives to tackle mass atrocities, positive incentives to tackle serious external aggression, human rights abuses. In these sorts of cases, it doesn't seem that you'll be offering agents a positive inducement to act, positive incentive to act wrongly. On the contrary, it's to act rightly. So it doesn't seem then that we can simply dismiss economic incentives as bribes. If you're interested in exploring bribery a bit more, I put a couple of sources on the handout. So that's the first major form of incentive, economic incentive. Second major form, political incentives. These include the offers of prospective seats on international bodies, such as the EU. For instance, in response to a prospective war within Romania, where over 1 million Magyars reside, of Hungarian ethnicity, in the early 1990s, and potentially a war between Romania and Hungary that was at the time worried about to be similar scale to that seen in the former Yugoslavia during the breakdown of Yugoslavia in the early 90s. The United States and the EU offered Hungary significant direct economic incentives, and Romania as well. They provided $330 million US to Romania and $94.2 million US to Hungary. And the EU provided 816 million euros to Romania and 787 million euros to Hungary. They also offered the prospect of joining the EU, which offered potentially huge economic benefits as well to both countries. But this required Hungary and Romania resolve border issues and the problematic treatment of minorities. The relations between Hungary and Romania stabilized considerably, and the treatment of the Hungarian minority within Romania improved, in large part due to the incentives offered. So that's one example of a political incentive, joining a major international body, such as the EU. Other forms of political incentives, they include inclusion within the power sharing agreement, such as between a rebel movement and an incumbent government. You can offer to be part of the new government to a rebel movement if you're engaged in, say, mediation with them. You can also offer recognition of the party, of the, say, the rebel group or a movement within the state as the sole legitimate representative of the people. So you can say to these people, if you behave in this way, we will recognize you officially. Another is the offer of official visits and receiving representatives, as we've seen earlier with the example of Gerry Adams. Another example is the holding of prestigious positions. I'll go back to this slide that I went back to a bit too quickly earlier on. Here's a picture of someone. Do you recognize him? Well, he is the former head of FIFA, Sepp Blatter. And in May 2015, the Swiss government reportedly asked Sepp Blatter to offer the president of Burundi, Pierre Nkurunziza, sorry, I'm pronounced that right, Nkurunziza, a role as an international ambassador in return for stepping down peacefully rather than pursuing a third term. So they offered this really nice role to the president of Burundi to be an official ambassador for FIFA, going around doing lots of nice visits. If he would step down, to resolve all the serious tensions and the conflict within Burundi, human rights abuses. Unfortunately, he turned down the offer and significant unrest ensued as Nkurunziza went on to hold a third term. So that's another potential type of incentive. Holding prestigious positions. Interestingly, it was reported, this is a complete aside, interestingly it was reported very early on in the COVID-19 pandemic that this leader was one of the first heads of state to die from coronavirus. It's not clear whether that was actually the case or not, but that was reported. Nkurunziza died earlier in the year. Okay, third form of incentive, legal incentives. This is what we're going to focus on the third part of today's lecture, and they include amnesties and immunity from prosecution for various leaders or other officials, and this might involve exile. Who are the receivers of incentives? They include not only political leaders that I mentioned quite a few times already today, but also more generally the states and non-state actors. For instance, the state might be offered significant investment. Other prominent individuals, such as rebel soldiers or members of particular groups, might also be offered an incentive. For instance, in 2003, the war in Iraq, the US tried to bribe Iraqi generals not to resist the invasion. Let's then consider the case for incentives. I'm going to focus on three potential reasons that one might find them attractive. The first is called the non-coercive advantage. This is simply that they are not coercive. The point is this: there are fewer costs borne by the receiver than with other measures that we looked at in this module. Why does it matter, though, that they are not coercive? First, incentives are less likely to impose aggregate significant costs on innocent civilians. Although not often intentional, other measures that we've looked at, such as economic political sanctions, diplomacy, sometimes unintentionally coerce innocent civilians. This is, as we've seen, particularly with economic sanctions, with significant unintentional harms on civilians, and even potentially, according to some, intentional harms. Even with diplomatic sanctions, diplomacy, naming and shaming, they can unintentionally harm innocent civilians when you, for instance, name and shame another state. You might lose some trade deals, harm your own civilians. So they seem to impose fewer aggregative costs. And this is important because incentives seem to fare better in regards to the doing and allowing distinction that we looked at last week. Recall that this distinction from moral philosophy holds that other things being equal, it is worse to do harm than it is to allow it. Since incentives aren't coercive, they are less likely to do harm to innocent civilians, at least directly. So they're likely to do much better on this important distinction than many of the other options that we have looked at already. But you might think here that incentives are still somewhat coercive. So suppose, for instance, that Argentina offers Paula, a guerrilla fighter, several $1,000s to give up her weapons. And Paula would otherwise struggle to feed her family. Suppose that she's fighting somewhere in South America. The situation isn't one of free choice. Significantly coerced by her hugely deprived economic situation and the need to feed her family. Is the offer that Argentina presents in this case, is this coercive? Some might think so. On the other hand, perhaps it's not. It might be that the incentive, it might not be that the incentive is coercive, rather the situation in which she finds herself. And this might be caused by the unjust situation within her state, or more generally, the global unjust economic system. And the incentive is merely responding to this situation. So it seems then that incentives can be seen as non-coercive, and this is a significant advantage for them because compared to other options, they're less likely to impose costs on civilians, and so less likely, in particular, to do harm to civilians. Let's turn to the second reason. This is what we can call the cost advantage. This second feature focuses on the costs for the sender, for those who are offering the incentive. So for those who are potentially thinking about how to respond to mass atrocities, serious external aggression. As we've seen in the previous lectures, war, economic sanctions, diplomacy can be quite costly for the responding party. By contrast, incentives can be much cheaper, especially over the long run. This is not only in terms of economic costs, but also other forms of costs, such as political costs and costs in lives compared to war. So part of what renders incentives less costly for the sender is that because they are not coercive, they are not subject to retaliation by the receiver. So they're not subject to the retaliation by those who are receiving the incentive, so those committing mass atrocities or those committing aggression. So we've seen already that economic sanctions can result in counter sanctions. For instance, Russia imposed retaliatory sanctions on the EU in response to EU sanctions on Russia after its annexation of Crimea. We've also seen that naming and shaming, diplomatic criticism, can result in in the criticized state ending trade deals with the critic. And of course, wars and intervention can result in the offender launching significant counter-offences. There's a quote here from Baldwin which nicely summarizes the point. He says that he who uses negative sanctions is more likely to have negative sanctions used on them, but he who lives by negative sanctions is likely to die by them. Now, one reason why we might think this is particularly important morally is because, if you recall in the seminars last week, we explored some of I mentioned at the end, the difference between cosmopolitan and nationalist viewpoints about how the strength of the obligations that we have towards our citizens. Now, both cosmopolitans and nationalists agree that we have obligations towards our citizens. They vary in how weighty they think they are. Regardless of which one of these one endorses, it does seem that we should be concerned about potential costs that we impose on our fellow citizens, even if we're strong cosmopolitans. If a measure is cheaper, reduces costs on our civilians, this is a reason in favour of it, given that we should try to, say, reduce our costs on one area and spend the resources elsewhere, such as on healthcare, for instance. Okay, the third point, this is quite straightforward, called the effectiveness advantage. Effectives can sometimes, but not always, be effective in addressing the situation or helping to ameliorate this. Give you an example here. Various political and economic incentives helped to bring to an end the 12-year civil war in El Salvador and secured a peace agreement in 1992. This included, most significantly, the prospect of recognition of the FMLN, the Farabundi Marti National Liberation Front, and this offer came from the United States in 1991. And this has since played a crucial role in the FMLN deciding to end the war. Now we're going to look in the second part of today's lecture at several objections that challenge the efficacy of incentives. But before we examine these claims, it's worth considering, on the other hand, why we might think that incentives are effective. Now, there's an obvious first point. Incentives can provide the receiver, those receiving their incentives, with a clear reason to stop being engaged in mass atrocities or serious external aggression. They get money, get recognition, get something else that provides them a reason to stop what they're doing. There are two more specific points, though, that are worth highlighting. The first of these is that incentives can play a key role when a leader wishes to comply but faces a recalcitrant domestic constituency. So, for example, in the aftermath of the First Gulf War, the United States offered significant economic incentives to Jordan to conclude a peace treaty with Israel, including a grant of $1 billion US, debt forgiveness of $4.3 billion US, and foreign aid. The incentives in this case enabled the King of Jordan to buy off domestic opponents who were otherwise opposed to the deal, given the level of investment they were placated by this. The outcome of this was the Washington Declaration, which led to a formal peace treaty between Israel and Jordan in October 1994. The second point here is that incentives have a notable comparative advantage over sanctions, over economic sanctions. A common objection to sanctions, as we saw in lecture 3, is that they will make the population, and particularly leaders, even more recalcitrant and result in the rally round the flag effect. This effect occurs, recall, when those who have serious reservations about the government still get behind it when it appears assaulted from abroad. By contrast, incentives don't tend to lead to such negativity. Instead, they often lead to a more positive view of the state that's offering the incentive. So this brings to an end part 1. In the first part of today's lecture, we've seen what incentives are, and we've explored 3 potential reasons for economic incentives and for political incentives as well. In part 2, we're going to look at some of the objections to economic and political incentives before part 3, focusing on legal incentives in particular.